Great. So I think we'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from for this webinar today. My name is Victoria Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of ISCN. We have over 100 higher education institutions across the globe, and we aim to showcase members who are demonstrating innovative sustainability and climate leadership projects and initiatives. It's a key goal of our network to enable transformative peer learning by connecting folks in different jurisdictions, many of whom are working on similar issues and challenges. We are really delighted to have Corey Peterson join us today, Chief Sustainability Officer from the University of Tasmania, to present using the building design and delivery process to deliver carbon reduction. Corey will share with us more about the university's emissions reduction strategic plan to 2030 that requires a 50% reduction across all scopes and includes an innovative financing approach, a green bond framework. So we're really delighted to have Corey here today with us. We will encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A. And with that, over to Corey.
Good morning, and thank you, Victoria. And thank you to ISCN as well for allowing me to come and have this conversation with you today. So Yapalingana from Lutruwita, Tasmania, lands of the Palawa Pakana people. I acknowledge their continuing custodianship of this land, of which they have had for over 60,000 years, and that is thousands of human generations. So without further ado, I'll jump into my presentation. So as Victoria said, I'm here to basically talk to you about multi-stakeholder delivery embodied carbon reduction in our construction program. And just make sure I'm on the right. There we go. First of all, just in case people don't know where Tasmania is, we are, if you actually look at the world map upside down, we're the crown on the island continent of Australia. So we are a small island state of Australia between Antarctica and the Australian mainland. We have campuses across all of the island, as well as in Sydney and Melbourne. And we have about 30,000 students, 2,400 full-time staff. We're the fourth oldest Australian university at 132 years old now. So we are technically a sandstone university, and you can see on the slide our original campus building in Hobart, which is the capital of Australia. So a little bit more about the University of Tasmania and why we are focusing on carbon reduction and how we arrange ourselves in our sustainability journey. So we do base a lot of what we do on the Sustainable Development Goals, and that informs our holistic sustainability approach. And then we strengthen that through a contextual lens for Tasmania in particular, and our university, as well as that includes that First Nations people focus. We have found climate action is the second highest SDG priority for students, and that's current and future students after SDG 4, which is quality education. We do base our strategic framework, as I said, on the SDGs, but also the our common feature definition about sustainable development, which is on the screen as well. Within the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, we have ranked #1 globally in climate action in 22 and 23, and we don't just focus on climate action. We have a holistic approach, as I said, so we've increased to #5 overall in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings. And within SDG 13 being #1, I think it's important for people to understand that while we do have hydroelectric power in Tasmania supplemented by some wind power, it isn't just being in Tasmania that allows us that #1 status. We do score perfect 100% of the points on environmental education. That's both internally and externally to our communities, and I've highlighted 2 of our main programs there. Education Sustainability Tasmania, which is the United Nations Regional Center of Expertise, and our Curious Climate Schools program that reaches out to students in primary and secondary schools. We're also one of 3 certified carbon neutral universities in Australia, and that means we have to address our scopes 1, 2, and material scope 3 emissions, and we have been carbon neutral since 2016 on a 2015 baseline. Which Victoria referenced. Our emissions reduction strategic plan target is based on that baseline. And then, of course, research comes into that, being an educational institution. So let's get into the meat of what we're talking about today. So construction is a major global emission source, and the University of Tasmania is no stranger to that. We have about a $750 million project of rebuilding our campuses, some new buildings, some refurbishments, and we're in the middle of that now, and I'll talk a little bit about that in detail. But today, 39% of global energy-related carbon emissions come from the construction sector, 28% from the operational, and 11% from materials and construction. And so we wanted to hone in on where everybody focuses on operational emissions, but what are we doing about our materials and construction? And then it is anticipated that by 2060, the total global floor area of buildings will double, with more than 50% anticipated within the next 20 years. And we like to think our university is contributing to that, so we need to minimize that impact. So as I said, we're in the mid-process of over $750 million program. Sorry, at 7 a.m. my voice is coming around. I'll get to it. And that covers, as I said, new builds and major refurbishments across all our campuses in New South Wales, as well as our main Tasmanian campuses. And I've just put a few pictures up there of our library building on the far left. You'll see there just won a national award. It's the best library in Australia. So that was pretty exciting for the team. And then a number of our other major projects are listed there, and it highlights our use of timber, natural colors, Aboriginal engagement as far as the artworks in the buildings, etc. And then our campus that we fully finished is up in Burnie, and that's the one with the wording on it, to show how we're actually contributing to the community with new railway paths, expanded penguin habitats, and then abandoned community facilities. So we don't just focus on university builds, but enhancing our local communities where we can. All right, so into the emissions side of it. So as I said, we have a baseline of 2015, and we have 15 to 17 material emission sources. Some of them are no longer material, but they're on the slide here. We have a 38,500 tons of baseline emissions over all the scopes. And in 2023, we had, in a way, climbed back up out of COVID to 34,000. And as you can see in the slide, construction is a major component of that. We anticipate all of our major construction activities will be well and truly done by 2030, and that will remove the vast majority of that emission source. But we wanted to acknowledge the embodied carbon that would come from that construction, that while we won't have the emissions into the future from construction, we needed to minimize those emissions now while we were doing that. It is right now our largest emission source, just closely followed by business travel and electricity use. So our emissions reduction strategic plan, as noted, has a minimum 50% reduction in gross emissions by 2030. So within all of the emission sources that are in this plan, which is 15 of them, we actually have a little bit of information that we've summarized for people. So you have an overall target reduction on the baseline. We have an immediate near-term target in 2025 and a 2030 target, and the contribution of that emission source to the overall reduction. And then you can see in the graph there our reported emissions since 2015 and the trajectory we need to get that on. Now, importantly, we identify enablers to enable the emissions reduction from that scope in the plan, and then we have an action table to say exactly how we're going to do that. So you'll see in the first one, there's a construction, I just put the two up here, is to ensure all new and refurbished buildings preference low carbon materials and fittings, and the KPI, which is part of our green bond framework, which I'll talk about as well, has a minimum 20% reduction in embodied carbon versus a reference building. We have actually, the internal target is 30%, but the official target is 20. So we have made sure that we've always been over 30. We started with the first two builds, we've achieved 32 and 34, but now we're up into the 40% on new builds and 60% on refurbishments. So as I said, we use a green bond framework that we're able to identify that target of 20%, but internally 30. And that is based on the Green Building Council of Australia's Green Star Building Standard. And that was what we used to identify the reference buildings, how we go about this, how we do the methodology to claim those embodied carbon reductions. Okay. So what do we have to do to actually achieve that? we actually need to engage all of our stakeholders, hence the title of the thing is about multi-stakeholder engagement. So you need to start at the very beginning, otherwise it gets very expensive over time. So you need to get your ESD consultants and your building designers and be very clear in your scope what's required. So anybody that's coming in that wants to be involved in the project knows up front that they need to prioritize carbon reduction. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those specifics in a minute. But that includes, as I said, the designers, but right through to the building contractors, the materials suppliers, so all of your supply chain, so that they're aware what you're trying to achieve. And you need to make sure that your own university project management staff are on board and know that this is a priority that they need to drive in their communications with all of these external entities. And then, of course, involving my team in that conversation is very helpful as well for cutting edge and innovative approaches to things. So just to be clear what we're talking about, so there is upfront carbon, which is the carbon emissions associated with the initial construction of the building. And then this is an example from our River's Edge building, which is also on our Inverest campus in Launceston, and where we've identified a 32% reduction in upfront carbon. And then if you include the sequestered carbon with all the timber that we've included, which is Tasmanian timber, we increase that to 33.1%. And our embodied carbon reduction, which is associated with the initial construction of the building, plus material replacements and maintenance over the building life, and processing and disposal materials at the end of the building life, that then brings it down to 28.9%. As well saved, and operational carbon 22.6%. So if you looked at it from a whole of life carbon perspective, it's a 26.1% reduction on a reference building essentially. So some of the initiatives that we undertook within this building that we actually then use the lessons learned to other buildings on that site and around the state was that the biggest carbon source, which I'll show you on the next slide, is lower carbon is in concrete. And so we worked with, and I've put the registered trademark up there, Boral and Vizia is a specifically designed concrete to meet all the requirements of the build, but has a significantly lower carbon footprint. We also reused, ironically, I guess you could say, about approximately 2.6 kilometers of disused natural gas pipeline. And that came from mainland state, Queensland, and we had that brought down. So instead of using concrete pilings or treated timber, because we were going into anywhere between 14 to 25 meters of essentially muddy sediment, because it's in a floodplain, and we just wanted to make sure we weren't causing pollution or additional carbon emissions from that. So we were able to use these old pipelines, which was pretty exciting. We replaced asphalt with compacted rock. We used low impact internal finishes for the flooring, partition, construction, and wall finishes. We also use certified and locally sourced carbon neutral bricks. So it's also a carbon neutral product similar to the university. And then, as I said earlier, we used a lot of timber and structural elements and made sure that was used in the Tasmanian supply chain to keep the money in Tasmania. We also did a number of other things that weren't specifically focused on embodied carbon, heat capture, electric charging stations for cars, bikes, and scooters, a really nice end of trip facility with showers and lockers and all that you would expect. And then we reduced our gross floor area from our old campus at Newnham, which is about 4 or 5 kilometers out of town. And so we were able to consolidate and just be better users of the space we have as a university. So getting into some of the specifics of what we did, some of the design elements were to use a post-tension structure, which reduced carbon by 155 tons. And then we, as I said, the reused steel for the structural piles was a significant 238 tons voided. And the concrete was the biggest one, as I said, at 519 tons avoided. And then using timber was avoiding using steel and other things in the top levels, so 122 tons there, plus then you have that sequestered carbon from using timber. And then the other things are in there, timber atrium roof, timber stairs, etc. Meaning that all adopted initiatives delivered a 1,276 tons of carbon avoided, and including then 100 tons through sequestration. So we achieved for the River's Edge building, as I said earlier, over 30%. So we achieved 35.2% reduction, and then a building that's coming after that using learnings from this. I believe we're up to about 38 or 39% reduction, which is pretty exciting. And of course, this is about upskilling all those people that have been involved in the project so they can go off and make sure that's happening in other building projects in Tasmania and further afield. Another way of looking at that is these colored bar charts. So if you just wanted to really have an understanding versus a reference building or the original proposed building that we had looked at, and then what we actually delivered. So standard practice or reference building versus proposed. So we achieved at Willis Street a 35.5 and Rivers Edge a 35.2 reduction overall, including sequestration. And so, as I said, we used this green bond framework. This was won an award, national award, because it was the first green bond framework in Australasia that focused on embodied carbon, not just operational emissions. And so it achieved a lot of interest from around the world from major investment houses. We ended up borrowing $350 million in 2 tranches, which were quite favorable to the university in interest rates. And we were way oversubscribed. We could have had well over $1 billion lent to us because they were pretty excited about our approach on this, and it was very sector leading, we were told. So that was pretty cool to see. We've applied that green bond framework and the monies we've borrowed across a number of projects. So there's 5 projects that I've included in this slide. We have an average reduction versus reference buildings of over 32% for new builds. So that, remember, the ones we started early on didn't achieve quite as much as we're achieving now because it took a little while to learn what we can do. And then that 60% for repurposing. So overall, we've avoided over 13,000 tons of CO2 on these 5 projects, which is pretty impressive if you look at it in the chart that's here. And that's directly because we focused on it and we got green bonds to pay for it, which was fabulous. So the key success factors, again, was that green bond framework, and that tied together that funding and emissions reduction that attracted that broad interest globally. And that was really important internally as well, because as we do have a holistic focus on sustainability, for me to be able to work with our finance people and the investment people and tie our environmental environmental impacts into the financial impacts was able to get them thinking about a holistic sustainability approach to what we do. And the investment people were already on board. We're a university that's fully divested from fossil fuels in 2021 as well. And that's been a very useful story to tell alongside this. Again, another key success factor is those design guidelines. You need to be very clear up front that you have a broad sustainability focus, but that you're focusing on embodied carbon reduction, and that you're aligning that with the built environment function of all the other things we need to be delivering. Procurement documentation, incredibly important for the right clauses and phrases to put in there, and clear on the expertise that you're seeking so that the designers get the right ESD consultants and such that are looking at this and understand how it works. And make sure there is a specific budget allocation for sustainability outcomes so it can't get traded out. And then engaging, like I said, a broad range of suppliers. And what that's done is it's upskilled delivery teams, designers through to project managers and builders across Tasmania. And they have come out publicly and said, without the university driving this, they wouldn't necessarily have done it so quickly and so early. And now it's being embedded in projects across Tasmania run by the private sector and state government and such as well. So we like to think we brought some expertise and upskilling into Tasmania. There, I think the slide pack will be shared. I've just got links there to all sorts of information that support what's in this presentation that you can have a look at. And I'll leave it there. I know it was a bit quick, but I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Jen, I think we just need to unspotlight so that I can join Corey for a couple of questions.
And shall I stop screen sharing as well?
Nope, that's perfect. You can leave that there. Okay. So Corey, great. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. And also congratulations on your leadership. Seeing the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, super impressive. I know that matters when we're trying to advance this kind of work across our institutions. they're not, the perfect systems always, but they do matter. So it's really impressive to see your leadership there. I have a couple different questions, but I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more about this green bond framework. I haven't seen that sort of referenced very much in the university setting, and I'm wondering if you can just explain how that works. Are you one of the only universities that have used this? Are others starting to adopt this kind of green bond framework?
I think it's still relatively rare because a lot of institutions aren't going out and doing, multi hundreds of millions of dollar redevelopment projects, and the major investment houses around the world seem to be looking for, significant 100 million plus investments versus in the tens of millions, which is, what a normal single building would cost. So the green bond framework, essentially, there is a standard out there. So if you look it up, and it's on that previous slide, and maybe I'll just go back to that. If you go have a look at that, there's the International Capital Market Association's Green Bond Principles. So we had a look at that at the start and said, okay, well, we have all these commitments around sustainability. We're doing all this building stuff. We need money to do more of it and do it properly. So I was working with the finance people, and I said, what about green bonds? And they were like, oh, don't know anything about them. And so we did a lot of research on that and said, okay, what we need to do is have our own University of Tasmania green bond framework. So it's really clear to our internal decision makers and partnering businesses on our commitment and what we want to do with that money. And then once we you have to, I guess we partnered with some major banks and said, we need to take this out. We want to getting into that lending market, and we're interested to meet with people. So we ended up having 2 days of these hour-long meetings with like 10 different major investment companies, I guess they're called, in
Mm,
Japan, North America, Europe, etc. And we had these intense conversations, make sure that there's a lot of really good questions from some of them about greenwashing, authenticity
mm.
of what we're doing and our real commitment to it. And I was able to point to, all of our strategies and the awards we've gotten and all sorts of things to explain that this is real. We really want to do this. And so what that does is it sets up a framework that works in that financial world that says this is what we're committing to deliver. So we actually have to report every year on all of our building efforts, what we've done. And so some of the things I've shared in that slide are from our green bond reporting to these investment houses, to say, yes, we're delivering on what we said we would deliver on, because there's penalties if we don't. And that's, yeah, it's quite useful. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it strikes me there's different models in local government and bond processes that are used and such. So I'm just be interesting to sort of consider for our members, others who may be interested in testing the waters. I appreciate you're talking about huge sums of money, so it really needs to be a comprehensive sort of campus-wide effort. But
Mm.
super interesting. So I'm curious just a little bit of the background, and you covered it at the upfront, but like you've got a super comprehensive sustainability commitment and policies and programming. What was the impetus for leadership early on to adopt this? Because it's pretty leading edge. It's committing right across the institution. What would you sort of point back to as the leadership points of moving this whole agenda forward?
Yeah, it's been slow and steady. So I was hired in 2010 as a sustainability project officer to deploy recycle bins, and I
Mm,
think it was the fact we're in Tasmania helps. So the world's first green party started here. So there's a certain understanding in the broader community of the value of environmental sustainability, but also sociocultural sustainability, and that helped get a coalition of interested persons and passionate people across the university. And we started as I think it was an environmental management group for a few years, became an environmental management committee. We started getting some really good runs on the board around basic operational sustainability things. And we've just sort of been growing it over time. We've partnered with student groups. It took 6 years to get to our divestment, which delivered carbon neutrality along the way because students and staff were pushing that all the way through the process. We had a step change when we got a new vice chancellor in 2018, who was quite keen, understood the value of sustainability as a unique element of the University of Tasmania that we could authentically deliver on, that would make us more appealing to potential staff, students, etc., but also have an impact on the Tasmanian community more broadly. Tasmania is not, it's a paradise in many ways, but we have basically a 40-some% functional illiteracy, 50% functional innumeracy in Tasmania. We have huge low socioeconomic disadvantage areas, which is why we have campuses around the state. We have a vice chancellor and a leadership team that are very much about positive impact in Tasmania across a number of things, including supply chains, employment in Tasmania, upskilling, all of that. So I think it's been top down and bottom up interest in this space. We've been very clear as the sustainability interested people across the university in the details of what we can deliver and how we need to deliver it. And then they've given their imprimatur to say, yep, let's go forward and do that. And so every win pushes that next step. And this was a really exciting one to get the finance people on side and get them to understand, because they already kind of got it from the divestment activities. And this was just a positive turn on that. And because of this, our whole investment policy has changed. So we don't just have negative screening. Back in 2021, we actually put a positive screen. So we will proactively invest in things that help deliver on the SDGs. And it's a whole different mindset for our investment committee to be looking for things, not just saying, what are we not investing in? What are we actually going to proactively focus on? And so part of that is investing in our built environment so that we can demonstrate to our communities what can be done.
Excellent, excellent. And you noted there, increasingly we're seeing students are actually asking, if you talk to the student recruitment teams, students are asking, what is the university doing? It's one of their now decision-making criteria in selecting universities. So I think that moves the whole agenda forward for our sector, which is excellent. There's a question here in the chat. Was there any friction with building companies, or were they just keen to sort of step up and innovate and meet your requests?
I think in the tendering stage, some didn't think we were as serious as we were, and that was made very, very clear to them. And those that didn't kind of get on board weren't in the running anymore, very clearly, and they were told why. And so that's changed some perspectives. Tasmania is a small community, so I've talked to some people, and they wanted to know why they kind of didn't get a look in. And I said, well, you didn't think we were serious at the end of the day. And so the ones that are forward looking companies in Tasmania have been amazing. They've come up with ideas because they know the industry. And they're like, what if we do this and this and this? And and this group, they're supplying these carbon neutral bricks. Let's put that in the design. And so the design changed based on what materials were available as well, to a certain extent sometimes. Yeah.
Great. So just in thinking about my sort of opening remarks around peer exchange and really learning from others, what advice would you have for others who are maybe trying to knit together the cohesiveness that you've been able to bring in your finance people, get them on board to have students sort of asking the right questions? So just general advice, things that come to mind on other universities. We've got a whole range in our network, and we've got folks that are starting on a pathway around some of these topics that haven't made as much progress as you. So what would you give them by way of advice?
The two best things to do is do your benchmarking, especially within the sector. Find the subject matter, the people that are their peers. So going to the finance people and say, the University of Tasmania, for example, has done this. This is their finance people, get them to talk to their peers and understand the drivers within their interest area. What are the things they're trying to deliver on? So for us to say, well, we want embodied carbon reduction, but hey, we got you a really good deal because of our sustainability activities on our interest rates and all of those things. It was very favorable. So don't go to people with necessarily just a sustainability mindset and try to get to talk about it, because that's what matters to you, because that's your profession. Talk to a procurement person about procurement and what other universities are doing around procurement, or networks, or even their own sectoral bodies, Australian Universities Procurement Network, working with them to engage back into the universities and say, to be innovative, you need to be doing these things, and we're your peers, so have a listen.
That's great. And I'm going to flip the question, and I don't see any others in the chat, so maybe I'll end with this one. But what are the questions on your mind now? You've made this sort of great program. You've been able to innovate and implement. What's sort of on your mind in terms of what's next and what you're curious about?
Good question. There's the whole sense of, okay, embodied carbon reduction, but where's the well, we do have good sociocultural elements within it, but it's how can we extend biophilia and making these just even more outstanding buildings over time? And then that refurbishment piece, this is great. It's easy to do in new buildings, but what are you doing in refurbishment, recognizing the current embodied carbon that is in that structure? And then how can you restructure those buildings for new flexible uses and things so that you're basically future proofing your university?
Great, great. Okay, well, I think with that, we will wrap up. And unless there's any other, I see another question in the chat about a green bond. I think it's talking about other innovative financing mechanisms, if you know of others, but I think we somewhat covered that a little bit. But maybe as you were looking around at the green bonds, were there other financing mechanisms that you were contemplating?
Well, interestingly, we are doing a renewable energy push within the university. Yes, we're in Tasmania, it's predominantly renewable, but I want to be able to be 100% certified renewable. So we're looking at different ways of financing that energy piece through power purchase agreements, which is relatively common in the sector now as well. Energy performance contracts are relatively common, but are there other innovative ways of trying to achieve the funding while getting community awareness and buy-in? So, for example, engaging with your alumni, I'd love to do a
Mm,
sponsor a panel approach, so the alumni feel that they're actually contributing. I don't think this is commercial in confidence. The University of Tasmania spends over $9 million a year in electricity, which has been a great selling point for energy efficiency activities, renewable behind the meter, and all these
mm,
other things to save that money because we're all in a constrained environment now in our sector. So yeah, some of those things I'm thinking of different ways. Of course, trying to find grants where you can, but nobody's going to give you tens of millions of dollars. You may not getting a
right.
couple of tens of thousands, as we know in our sector. But yeah, just you always have to be on the lookout. Yeah, and if anybody has any ideas, please send me an email. That would be fabulous to hear what you're
Yeah.
thinking.
Exactly. And we as a network have been thinking about what are the opportunities to work collaboratively across a number of institutions and pursue external funding. So again, that's not for the big capital projects, but from this, student learning perspective or from the staff, student, faculty mobility, learning from other universities. Like we keep trying to really push the envelope on seeing where funding exists, whether it's foundations, philanthropy, alumni for sure, who want to invest and support our universities around climate and sustainability. It's such
Mhm.
an important topic for so many people. I've got one more specific question here. Um, Sort of this is around the design process. So, how did you engage with suppliers? Much of our procurement practices prevent engagement with contractors until design is well underway. So, sort of, you needed to do that ahead of the design being well underway.
Yes and no, because it was more of an iterative design process. So that was a bit different than standard design. So we made it clear up front what we were trying to achieve. And so, of course, the architects and the designers were looking at that up front. But once we identified our primary building contractor, we continued the design process with them, and they know their supply chains. They know where they could get things that maybe our designers and architects didn't. They could also pre-engage. So for one of a building in Hobart that we're doing, revamping it, we're trying to again be proactive in carbon sequestration. So we've got the largest hempcrete wall going in a
Mm,
commercial build in Australia, at least. There's 200 cubic meters of hempcrete going in, and that's supporting a nascent hemp industry in Tasmania and a small business and the association that's doing that. And so that kind of came through the design process. How can we get rid of lots of plasterboard? How can we highlight a new Tasmanian product? Tested it out. The builders tested it with the installers before we committed to it in the design. So we have a test wall of it. And yeah, it was an iterative piece. So your whole design process needs to change a little bit so that you're working through every single material choice and saying, okay, what are the options? What does that change in the design process from the timber studs in the walls versus steel versus plasterboard, or I can't remember what we called it in North America, but plasterboard is what they call it here. Sheetrock, I think, is the other term for that.
Right.
That's a carbon intensive material. So we were trying to minimize that as well and do product substitution wherever we could. So understand your design process needs to be a little different as well.
Great. Good. Well, again, Corey, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Great overview of the work that you're doing. Congratulations again, and we look forward to further collaboration with you.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Victoria, and thank you all.